Resuming debate, the honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The law is clear that adequate housing is a human right, but many of the 22% of Canadians with disabilities are being left behind. The National Housing Strategy embeds Canada's international human rights obligations to implement the right to adequate housing, but as this motion points out, the National Housing Strategy is missing recognition of the additional barriers to housing faced by persons with disabilities. The motion has the opportunity to correct that. Article 19 of the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities notes that equal rights of all persons with disabilities to live independently and to inclusion in the community. That is not happening under this government. The Government of Canada is failing to live up to its obligation to ensure adequate, accessible and affordable housing. We see the housing crisis manifesting in communities across this country. There are people in Canada suffering, and the government has a responsibility to fix it, to build homes, to have affordable homes, and to stop the homelessness crisis in Canada, and to recognize that persons with disabilities have even more barriers to housing. Canadians with a disability are greatly overrepresented in the homelessness population. 45% of Canada's homeless have a physical or mental disability, and core housing need is at least 16% higher for persons with disabilities. In BC alone, nearly 4,000 people living with disabilities are on a wait list to find an accessible home. Housing demands far exceed availability. Only 5% of units in BC are targeted for accessibility, despite the fact that 15 to 20% of Canadians live with one. It has been said that the only true disability is the inability to accept and respect people's differences. Living up to the legal obligation to protect human rights means understanding equity and addressing long-standing inequities. How can those inequities be fixed if the decision-making tables are missing those perspectives? This motion seeks to begin to correct that. The lack of representation at decision-making tables is also contributing to poverty. There are links between poverty, homelessness, and living with disabilities. According to one IRIS report, people living with disabilities are twice as likely to live below the poverty line. In fact, living in poverty is likely to increase instances of disability. While there are no concrete numbers on how many people experiencing homelessness in Canada live with disabilities, we know there are many. The Centre for Justice and Social Compassion estimates that 45% of all people experiencing homelessness are disabled or diagnosed with a mental illness. Given that the Canadian Survey on Disability showed that 13% of Canadians self-identified as having a disability, this shows just how overrepresented people living with disabilities are in the homeless population. Street Health Toronto found that 55% of people experiencing homelessness had a serious health condition, and of those, 63% had more than one. In a report by the Daily Bread, it was reported that almost 50% of people frequenting Toronto food banks have a disability, and that includes persons with invisible disabilities. Invisible disabilities such as anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia are not always seen out in the community, but it does not make them any less limiting in this ableist world. Long COVID, for which there is no single test, and with symptoms varying from person to person, joins the list of invisible disabilities with very real impacts. This reality needs to be addressed, and investments in supports and benefits are required from this government. And accessing those supports and benefits must be easier. Accessing benefits has always been a barrier. Complicated processing, confusing paperwork, and all too often, these are more challenging for persons with disabilities. In the Globe and Mail, Michael Prince wrote about how people with severe and prolonged disabilities face many challenges when trying to get their benefits and appealing decisions when their applications are rejected. Prince claims that the system is structurally flawed and asks, who's suffering? The clients and their families who confront new obstacles to access programs vital to their well-being and financial security. Madam Speaker, when the very systems put in place to support persons with disabilities are themselves exclusionary and unaccommodating, it is any wonder that these people are living in poverty and falling through the cracks. And when that system is keeping them from housing, the very basic right, their very basic human right, is being violated. The government needs to stop this violation and build the accessible, affordable homes required. When I was first elected, I asked an order paper question about accessible housing. I asked about what accessible housing we are losing each year in this country. CMHC came back and said CMHC does not collect data on accessible units that have been lost or decommissioned. I also requested some stats from CMHC about federal funds used to build accessible units and to convert existing units to accessible housing. Their response only included the National Housing Strategy Program, even though I asked it for data since 2010. This meant that no data was collected on accessible housing until 2017. And for the first 3 years, from 2017 to 2020, there was nearly no data. Only in the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021, was there any data of any measurable consequence. Liberal and Conservative governments have failed to deliver on housing for all Canadians. How could it not be if they're not even collecting the data? The need to act cannot wait. We cannot have one more person with a disability forced into a tent on the street like the ones we see every day on the way to this house here in Ottawa. As this motion says, prioritize the creation and repair of accessible units through the National Housing Strategy programs. The government cannot move fast enough on that. Let us not forget how Canadians got into a situation where housing is unaffordable and inaccessible. Conservative and Liberal governments have overseen the financialization of housing. Instead of protecting our social and accessible housing stock, they encouraged upzoning and gentrification in the name of density, forcing persons with disabilities living in poverty out of their homes. Density dreams, Madam Speaker, are for developers and investors. The financialization of housing is only working for the super wealthy and is leaving the rest of Canadians behind. The National Housing Act is legislated that the Government of Canada's housing policy is required to recognize that the human right to adequate housing is a fundamental human right affirmed in international law, and that housing is essential in the inherent dignity and well-being of the person. The government must do better. The housing minister must live up to his words. He has committed, and I quote, that every single project that seeks to get money from the federal government to build housing, whether it be private sector, government, another order of government, or the non-profit sector, must have minimal accessibility requirements. He went on to say that unless they fulfill accessibility requirements from our government, they don't get a single dime from us, and that barrier-free housing for Canadians with disabilities is a priority of the National Housing Strategy and always will be. Even if M59 does not pass, the NDP will hold this government to those words. I must point out, though, I am not sure the government has an achievable goal here, as we are still waiting to hear what the government means by the word accessible. In the Human Committee, I asked specifically for information around the government's definition of accessible, because I have some experience that it's very hard to get the market to build accessible housing. When the response came back from CMHC, the word accessible was only written once, and the accessibility definition was not included. This government needs to do better and identify what definition they are using in their commitment to accessible housing. In closing, I appreciate the member from London West for highlighting the gaps at the decision-making tables around housing and in the National Housing Strategy, and the need for a more inclusive understanding of housing needs in Canada. With the failings of this government around providing accessible and adequate housing for Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and more, I encourage this government to do better and to start realizing that one size does not fit all, and adding to that the aging population. We need a better approach to accessible, affordable housing in this country, and the debate today is an important step in all of us thinking about how to solve the problem of a home for everyone in Canada in a more inclusive way.